everyone, welcome back to another painting walkthrough video. I hope everyone's doing well. Today we're going to be using this clayboard textured panel, which I've used clayboard before, but I had not used a textured clayboard before. So it says it's ideal for watercolors, but can also be used for other media applications, like it says. So we're going to hope that it's going to be okay for oils, which is what I'm going to be using today. We're going to start with the base of acrylics and then work oils on top of it. I'm assuming it's going to be very absorbent because it's for watercolors, which I don't mind because it kind of speeds up the dry time on it. It's a similar texture to drywall, so that's sort of the texture we're going to be working with today. Like I said, never used it before, so we'll see how we go. And you guys probably know by now that I like a relatively smooth surface to paint on, just because I think my portraits look a little bit more realistic that way. So I did give it a little bit of a quick sand before I started. You can definitely still tell that there is a little bit of texture though, which I like because I have been leaning into a little bit more textured surfaces recently. You can see by my previous video that I did actually use linen for the first time and thoroughly enjoyed it. So I am leaning into it a little bit, but still prefer it relatively smooth. So as you can see here, we're mixing up our acrylic base, going for like a muted minty green color. I thought an acrylic base was absolutely necessary with this painting because of the surface that we're working on. It says it's quite absorbent, and I was really worried that it was going to soak up all of my oil paint, so I think a layer in between is really important. Also, acrylic paint has a different sheen than oil paint. I think it provides a nice contrast in the final look. But before we get to painting, I actually need to tell you what we're actually painting. And now if you haven't seen the movie Girl Interrupted, I mean, do yourself a favor, but I took some screenshots because I was really inspired by Brittany Murphy's character Daisy. Just her pouty face and her little 60s hair I thought would make a really cool straight on portrait. So I took some screenshots and I landed on this one. I thought would make a really cool composition. I cropped the picture to a square because we're going to be working with a square panel today, and very generally edited some of the colors because overall the movie is quite a desaturated tone and I like it to be a little bit more saturated, but I'm going to be changing it once I start painting anyway. It's just a loose base to start off with. And once I was happy with that, I then opened my most used app, which is Procreate, and created a custom canvas to the exact ratio of my panel. So I made it 12 inches by 12 inches, and then I made it 300 dpi, which I think is what you're supposed to do. I don't really know anything about that, but I'm not going to be printing this out or anything, so that doesn't really matter too much. I just want it to be a good quality canvas on my iPad, just so I can have the most detailed reference possible. I then import the image, and this is where I decide on the composition. I didn't want it to be super symmetrical or have the ends of her hair touching the edge, so I spent a bit of time adjusting that. Now the film had the top of her head cropped off, but my idea was to have a really straight on portrait where you see the whole head and then the background. I didn't want this to be cropped in any way, and so I decided to paint the rest of her hair up and just kind of make up what the top of her head would look like. I pretty much just color selected the existing colors that was around it, including the hair, the headband, and the background. And I was nervous that it wasn't going to look convincing enough, but I think it came out alright, and I was really happy with the reference that we have. So once we have that now, we'll continue painting. Going in with this underpainting, I immediately noticed how absorbent this panel actually is. Here I'm showing you that I put on a very thick amount of paint. Like, I wasn't conservative with it at all. Very thick, and it instantly dried. And I was a little bit worried, but also thankful that I did do an acrylic base first. If I had gone in with my oil paint straight onto this panel, I probably would have cried because oil paint is expensive. So if you're going to use this product, I highly recommend that you do a base of acrylic paint first. Not sure if it will make a huge difference, but I'm glad that I did it anyway. Going in with some oil paint now, I'm mixing up a sort of burnt sienna color to do my sketch. I made sure that the acrylic paint on my panel was dry, and given how absorbent this panel actually is, it was very much dry, but I did wait a day to make sure that it was fully dry before I go on top of any water-based paints with oil paint. And I gotta say, this sketch, I had such a blast. I get nervous with sketching because there's a lot of stress that comes with it, but this sketch came together super quickly, super smoothly. I didn't have any major issues with proportions or anything like that, and I love the colors that I used, that burnt sienna kind of color against that sage green. It was such a beautiful combo, made a really pretty complementary color duo, and it really inspired me to maybe make a painting in the future with this color combination. And it was one of these sketches where, I don't know if anyone else has done this, but they sketch and it either took a really long time to do it, or they're really proud of it, or they just really like the look of it. They don't actually want to paint on top of it. That was me with this sketch. I fell in love with it and I was like, oh, maybe I should just like leave it like this. Obviously I do paint over it and have zero regrets in doing so, but I really did love this sketch. I actually was quite sick at the time of making this, and I was in a lot of pain. I was really tired, really grumpy, and the sketch just lifted my spirits. So my hopes were high from the very beginning of this painting. I really wanted to do this painting, this idea, this character for a really long time. And sometimes, at least for me, when an idea has been with you for a while, it kind of builds up and then you finally do it and it doesn't meet your expectations. I was really worried that was going to happen with this painting, but so far so good. I think it looks like her. I don't think I got the mouth fully correct in the sketch. Things are looking a bit off there, and maybe the eyes are a little bit out of whack, but overall, a good start. Now here, I did forget to press record when I was putting down the initial blocking in of the hair, but you kind of get the gist. I'm just getting a sense of the color and values of the hair as it's the darkest part. I'm also blocking in the bluish teal background, and you'll see later how often I change this background color. It never really seemed to click. I wanted the green acrylic base to come through, so I'm doing a crisscross slash patchwork painting texture on the background so that those pockets of green do still come through. And that's why I love doing acrylic bases. It was also to avoid the absorption of the oil paint with this particular panel that I was using. But to create this particular texture, I wouldn't be able to do that green poking through of a completely different medium. Acrylic paint and oil paint have different sheens, and you can see the work that goes into it by the end result of all these different layerings of these different types of paint. And of course, we're cracking out the good old trusty printmaking roller. If you know, you know, I have used this printmaking roller in all of my paintings recently. It creates this really cool texture. I wanted the background color to come over some of the hair and also some of her hair going into the background. So there's this movement between the background and the figure. Heading over to the face now, I am finally adjusting the mouth. Her left side was a little bit too far to the right, so I pushed it over further to the left, and I think that really helped the symmetry of her face. That central line was maybe just a little bit askew when I sketched it in. With my darkest shade that I've mixed up on my palette, I'm just blocking in the darkest area of her face just to key those in and really help my values when I'm starting to now block in the first layer. So I've done the first layer of her hair, her neck, and her dress, and now I'm doing the first layer of her face, starting at the darkest section. So you saw me block in all of those dark values of her eyes, nose, and mouth. Now I'm going ahead and painting the parts of her face that are in shadows. I'm also including a lot of the background color into her skin. This is really important if you want to make sure that your object or person looks like they're a part of the environment that you're painting them in. My background color is a little bit more saturated than the reference photo background color, so I do then need to change the skin tone slightly that's coming off of my background color and putting it onto her skin, as that's going to be different to the reference photo. Sorry if that just really confused you. What I mean is that I'm just including the background color onto the sides of her face that are going to make contact with any sort of reflected light. So you can see here, some of the background color is incorporated in my shadow tone so that it looks like that she is a part of the space that I put her in. By the way, guys, if you are curious about any of the materials that I'm using, I will list everything in the description below. The clay board that I'm using is the Ampersand version. It doesn't really look like that because I think it's an old version, but it is the Ampersand version. So all of the information will be in the description if you're curious about any of the materials that I'm using. With this first layer, I was happy with all the colors and the saturation and my blending, but the proportions are really wrong, especially in these eyes. So please hold on, because it does get better. I know it's looking whack right now. Now that the first layer is done and is dry, I left it to dry for about 2 or 3 days. I can now go in and do a second layer, and now the second layer is when things start to really happen, and I'm so grateful for my first layer for supplying a general correctness of values and proportions, but the second layer is where I can really get stuck in on any details. I don't have to go very thick with my paint. That was something that I really struggled with for a long time with painting. I used to do a first layer in quite thick opaque paint, and then I felt like I needed to do the same amount of opacity and the same amount of thickness in the second layer, but that was just not the case. I could do a thicker, more opaque layer in the first, and that would cover the background color, set all my values and my proportions correctly, saturate areas, cover up all the things that I needed to do. It would look like a completed painting, but just not to the level that I want it to be at. And so then the second layer would come in. I don't have to apply so much paint. The second layer uses such small amounts of paint. It's basically just to adjust any colors, possibly adjust proportions, because I'm always doing that, make areas lighter or darker. But with such small amounts of paint, I can't really stress that enough. It helps me keep the smoothness of the skin because there's no ridges of opaque paint, especially in those darker areas. I really want to keep my thick paint in just lighter areas. Perfect example, the bridge of the nose here. This is probably where the thickest amount of paint is. Really brings the nose forward and creates a glow around your skin, making your skin look more dewy and more lifelike. Also in the reflections of her eyes, the tears, got sparkly little highlights all over it. Those are when I really want to use thick paint. So with everything covered in the first layer, I don't have to worry about opacity or thickness. Second layer comes in, I can just worry about color, saturation, and values, and then adding those thickness of paint in just the highlighted areas. Having now spent a lot of time on this particular panel that I've never used before, I actually started to really enjoy the texture that I was giving. Like I said, it was like a drywall texture, which made it at some points me feel like that I was painting on a mural almost. And sometimes my oil paint looked like watercolor, and I think that was because it looked like that I was painting on cold pressed paper, which, if you're not aware, is like the rough textured watercolor paper. So at some moments my painting looked like it was a watercolor painting, which I've always really admired watercolor artists. I mean, I personally think watercolor is the hardest medium to work with painting. I mean, it's all translucent, you have to reserve the whites of the paper. There's so many reasons as to why I respect watercolor artists the most. So it was really cool to not have the hassle of working with such a difficult medium, but still get a similar effect, which I've always really admired. Making our way over to the second eye of this portrait, you can see in comparison to the first eye, the left eye that we painted, as it's dried, the saturation and the values have really dulled down in comparison to the wet paint on the right hand eye. And this is the power of varnishing your painting or oiling out your painting, because you can see how much it is dulled out. And it's really hard because I really like that left eye, and it's annoying not seeing it at its full potential. So at the end, I will oil out just to show you the final result. And then maybe after like 5 or 6 months, I'll go ahead and varnish this painting as well. The trick is with varnishing though, like I mentioned, the acrylic paint that I painted as the base, I do want to poke through at the end because of its different sheens, because of its layering effects that I will give. If I smack a varnish all over the painting, it then evens out all of the sheens and kind of does the exact opposite of why I left the acrylic paint in there. So there's a little bit of hit and miss with varnish sometimes. With Daisy's dress, I really wanted to keep it as simple as possible. I wanted the viewer's eye to head straight to the portrait and not really worry about what she's wearing all that much because I don't think it's important. So I just very loosely painted a bunch of stripes. The pom-poms were just a shadow, a mid-tone, and a highlight. Added some knitting texture and some dots to communicate that this is a knitted sweater, and also left a bunch of that acrylic paint base poking through all the stripes. Okay, so now, okay, again, I forgot to hit record. I'm so mad at myself because it's very different. Let me explain. Although I really did like the background color that I chose, it was a very similar blue to her sweater and to her headband. I just thought, okay, it's looking very bleh, like very matchy-matchy. Everything's kind of blending together. Nothing is really standing out. And I kept thinking about the acrylic base color that I chose, that green color, and how I thought that it really complemented the redness in her, cheeks, eyes, and mouth. It didn't take away from what she was wearing. It didn't clash with anything much. I mean, it's very green, but I think it needed that punch, that sort of sickly color, because if you know the context of this movie, it makes sense. So I did a glaze of oil paint of a similar color to that acrylic base color all over the entire thing, covered up a lot of that blue. But you can still see the layering that I have done, which was the point of the glaze because I didn't want to cover up any of that work that I did previously. The glaze just provided a tinting of that original texture that I had. And you can also see me here bringing back some of that original blue tone. I think it's tinted a little bit more green. And I've just put it in certain areas, like on the rim of the right hand side and underneath the hair on the left. And I've had it layer on top of the hair and hang like vines, almost submerging the character. If you know, you know. And also brought back that paint roller just so I am not losing any of that original texture. And going back to the eyes, because they've been driving me mental, they've never looked aligned. I've noticed that the right eye is tilted a little bit downward, so I just went in and repainted the inner corners of her eyes to lift them further up, which means that I've had to repaint all those annoying eyelash shadows, but I repainted it and it looks heaps better in my opinion. Painting the hair now, as it looks very neglected, there's a lot of that original acrylic paint seeping through on the highlights. I went in and oiled it out quickly because it's been very dry for a very long time, and my goal with the hair was to leave some of that acrylic paint coming through, which is always tricky because you don't want it to look too jarring, but I wanted the background and the subject to dance with each other and to almost be as one. I don't love having plain backgrounds because I tend to overthink everything and things can look a little bit too cut and paste, like there's the subject and then I've just photoshopped a different color into the background, they look too separate, so I do like to merge the two together. So you can see in the bangs there and in the twirls of her hair down below, a lot of that acrylic paint is still coming through. Just leave those little pockets of the beginning parts of this painting. You get a sense of how this painting was made, and like I said, the dance between the two, how the background emerges with the subject and vice versa. It's really subtle. I honestly don't think a lot of people will notice it, but little things like that built up do make a difference and makes it look less like that Photoshop cut and paste style that I wasn't going for. Now that her sweater had dried, I was going to go in and start painting in her necklace, and then I decided, I really don't want to do that because it's going to take so long, because I'm going to have to paint the chain and then paint the skin tone that's around it to edit it. I'm going to have to make it look realistic, but then painting things really fine or really, really tricky was going to minus 20 years off my life, and I decided I was going to paint over it. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't important to the painting at all, so sorry if you were really emotionally attached to that necklace, but I decided that I wasn't going to paint it. Adding some finishing touches now, I'm going to add the highlights to her hair, and as you saw there, I made a sort of green tone, a very similar green that's to the background. Again, that's just to add the background color into the subject somewhere to make it look like that she's a part of the space that she's in. The next thing to do, which was a little bit risky, I'm actually going to say that it was a lot risky because I was going to glaze the whites of her eyes red. In the reference, she is technically crying, but I want to make it a little bit more evident that she is really crying. I love to increase the reds in people's eyes, whether that's in the eyes or around the eyes. So I decided to do a glaze, and I think that adds a subtle swelling or haziness, just a little bit more emotion. It also adds a nice contrast to the green of the background as well. And with that final detail done, we are finished. I really hope you guys liked the walkthrough of this painting process. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I had an absolute blast. I'm really glad that it turned out well. It was exactly what I envisioned. It's one of my favorite paintings that I've made recently, so thumbs up for improvement. I cannot wait to hang her up. But I hope you guys really enjoyed the painting process. I will say the lighting in this room doesn't really do her justice. It doesn't really show off that green background that took me an unnecessarily long time to nail. That particular background color, the green, for some reason reminds me of a psychiatric ward. I think it might be because of the show Ratchet, if you've seen that. Maybe that's why, but I think it's very suiting to the subject. Of course, guys, if you have any questions, please let me know down below. And with all that being said, I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!